All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us on the Monday, November 18th, 2019 meeting of the Falls Church City Council. We're delighted to have you here with us. I'm out of breath because some of us just attended a national day at George Mason University and dinner right before this meeting, so my apologies. I guess the first order of business looks like a joint session with our folks from the Urban Forestry Commission. So we're delighted to have you guys with us here today, and we appreciate the good work you've done and look forward to talking about some of the forestry and tree canopy issues that I think all of us have in mind and would like to improve on. Mr. Shields, is there anything we want to do to tee this up, this conversation?
Well, I'll turn it over to Mr. Szymanski, as our chairman of the Forestry Commission is going to kick things off. But in your packet is some read-aheads, but he will lay out what we'll cover today. Have a PowerPoint prepared as well.
Now I'm on. So I noticed that Urban Forestry Commission isn't quite rolling off your tongue yet, but you're not alone.
I'm getting there.
So I am Dennis Szymanski, I'm the chair, and I'm going to introduce the members that are here, and then we have a new member who's going to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about himself.
I'm Kathy Philpott-Costa, I'm the secretary.
I'm Kate Reich, City Arborist and Liaison to the Tree Commission, Urban Forestry Commission.
My name is David DeCoste. I was recently appointed to the commission. I think I was the one that Dennis was talking about. So I recently moved to the city about a year and a half ago. So from Los Angeles. So I'm excited to be part of the community and looking forward to helping volunteer and make things better from an urban forestry standpoint. So, thank you.
I'm Charles Prince, the urban forester of the city of Forestry.
All right, well, thank you all. We greatly appreciate the fine work you
So
do.
are we on?
Welcome aboard as well.
Yeah,
We are, okay.
we got the hot mic.
Dennis, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Okay, the meeting purpose slide? You got the, all right. The Doug. Yikes. Over the last year or so, residents have appealed to the Urban Forestry Commission and probably to council members as well, because they felt that mature tree removal was excessive on residential redevelopments in their neighborhoods. Most don't oppose redevelopment itself, but they question whether the city tries hard enough to protect existing mature trees during development. So our purpose with you is to respond to the public perception that the Falls Church city government is not caring for and protecting mature canopy trees, often unnecessarily tree removal. Next one, Kate. We're going to introduce a little bit of the rigorous process that the urban forestry staff undergoes. We'll talk about canopy coverage and then provide some key data to help you better understand the dimension of the tree canopy situation. We'll talk about potential strategies and then have a discussion with you about possible options. So the process includes grading plans, and Charles and Kate are going to take you quickly through the rigor that they engage in examining grading plans and communicating with the public. Kathy's going to talk about canopy coverage and key data. And so Kate and Charles.
So the grading plan review process starts with any construction project that disturbs more than 2,500 square feet. When you get a grading plan, landscape conservation plan is included in that. Before development, when we get a grading plan, as you see on the right, we look for existing trees and shrubs assessed by a certified arborist, the critical root zones, any off-site trees that could be affected, tree protection measures, and preserved tree canopy. We check all the data and work with the developer if we think more trees can be saved, and this happens fairly frequently.
Can I ask a question? What percentage of our projects need grading plans, and is that 2,500 square feet trigger similar across jurisdictions? Do we know that?
I don't know what other jurisdictions do, but the 2,500 square feet is the bottom limit for needing a tree conservation plan, because it's the same as needing a grading plan.
2,500, I think, is a cutoff in most all places.
And that's a state code provision, is the 25. Yeah.
Thank you. So on this plan here on the right, the existing trees are shown by these little dots here. The critical root zones are shown by the outer circle. Off-site trees for this property, this dark line here is the property line, and here is the neighboring trees. We want to make sure that any trees affected on the neighbor's property are worth saving, able to be saved, and make sure they're safe. Tree protection measures, it's really hard to see here because it usually coincides with the silt fence. It's kind of all this really dark triple line here. It's if you're looking at a grading plane, you can see it up close. So for preserved cover, the limits of disturbance ends here on this property, so this area here is undisturbed. So all this tree here and this small little tree here is preserved. When those trees are preserved, I go out and make sure that they're a tree worth saving. If it's invasive, we sometimes ask them to cut them down, but they don't get canopy cover or canopy credit for that tree. If it's a dangerous tree, a dead tree, we make them cut it down. So this is the grading plan preservation planting chart. You see here it has the lot area of 11,000 square feet. 20% of that is required to have canopy after construction, so that's 2,241. And you see the line below that is what they have preserved of 1,500, and they get a 25% preservation credit. Preservation credit is meant to encourage developers to save trees on the lot. So the bottom box there is what's required for tree planting after development, and what's shown on the plan on the right is the smaller circles with 15-foot diameter on those to show tree spacing, so that way any trees planted on site aren't planted too close. And I verify that after the planting is done.
Is that tree cover like the day that they are planted?
No, it's after 10 years, yeah. And that's stricter than other jurisdictions around us, and state code, stricter than state code.
Vice Mayor Khan?
Can you just, as I'm looking at the canopy coverage calculations, is that a math problem? How does, like that, when you get to 366 that's needed from the square feet, do we start at 1125 and go down? Can you just walk me through it? I'm having a
Yeah,
hard time.
okay, so 2,241 square feet are required on site.
Because the lot is 11,205 square feet.
That's
Okay.
correct, yes, 20% of the lot.
Got it, okay.
After, this is the preserved credit of 1,500.
Because that's how much they have agreed to preserve,
That's correct.
not how much you're telling them they have to preserve.
That's correct.
Okay.
So their preservation credit of 25%, which encourages them to save more trees.
Why do they get that credit?
That's an incentive that we built into the code in order to encourage people to save mature trees. They automatically get a 25% bonus if they're preserving native, healthy trees.
Got it. Okay, so that one just comes because you know that there are trees on the property that they are preserving.
Yes, so if you look at the drawing, the big circle near the bottom yeah, is an existing tree, and they measured the canopy cover from the ground or from an aerial photo. So that's where the 1,500 came from,
Okay.
is from literal on-site in this particular case. I should say that we looked for clear examples. So in this case, on this slide, that chart does not match that drawing. That was a very clear drawing, and that was a very clear chart. So the square feet are not adding up here.
That's right.
Yeah.
So then we get to 1875, tree cover provided on site.
Yes. And so we subtract that from the 2241 to get the remaining tree cover required from planting.
So the 366 is a replacement.
That's correct. Yes.
How many trees would that typically be? How would they fill that 366?
Generally 2 big trees. The maximum a new tree can get before any credits is 175 square feet at 10 years.
So that 366 is 366 after 10 years.
Yes, the planting credits are based on the Virginia Nurseryman's list. They have a list of the sizes trees are projected to get at 10 years of age or at 20 years of age. So we use the 10-year, we've modified it so that we don't have each tree having its own size. We put them into groups, but it's based on the Virginia Nurseryman's projections.
And those have to be native trees, I take it?
Yes, we do not give, let me think, we don't give bonus credits for non-native trees. So we don't forbid non-native trees, but because so much planting is required, I think we've had 1 cherry tree and 1 crepe myrtle planted in the last 5 years. All the rest have been native.
So for
Because
example, if
it's just-
somebody needed to
yeah.
make up that 366, they could technically do that by planting non-native trees to make up that difference? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but they would need at least 25% more trees.
Okay.
So they just generally don't. Incentives seem to be working in this case. So we don't forbid it, but we apparently don't need to forbid it.
So while we're on this math problem, one of the questions I often field is, because the requirement is 20% within 10 years, we don't care how you get to it, even though there is that preservation credit. Do we create any perverse incentives to essentially cut down because it's easier from when you're building a new house just to clear it and then replant? Do we find that that happens, or that most people try to do a good job of keeping what they can, provided that the root zones aren't disturbed?
Councilmember Hardy, we will go into some of the data, but what we find is that developers have an incentive to maintain trees, that any existing tree is more than 175 square feet already. I mean, 175 square feet is really small for a tree. So if you're saving a tree, you've already got more than a new tree credit. So a developer would have to pay someone to cut the old tree down and pay someone to purchase and plant several new trees to make up for the one he cut down. So there is not an incentive to cut down trees and replace them. It's the reverse.
Mr. Z,
Can
I
I
think
just
had a
add to
question.
that? Can I add to that? The incentive is not to cut the trees down, but just to build the houses as big as they can, and they can be built out to, as you can see, quite a large footprint. So that pretty much eliminates mature trees around the perimeter where equipment has to get in and all of that. So that's more of the incentive, right? And also, I should mention that the state has 2 tree preservation statute models, and one is called a replacement statute, and the other one's called a conservation statute. And we have the replacement statute, which means that we can't require a certain percentage to be conserved. Fairfax County, for instance, has a conservation statute, so.
Mr. Z, did you have a question?
Well, I do. I actually have a comment and a question. So as Ms. Philpott said, there's a conservation and replacement statute. I think that's going to be part of the subsequent conversation here. And at the end of my block, 200 block, there's a big hole in the sky where a big tree used to be, 5-foot diameter. They tore down the house. Of course, the tree by that time had accommodated itself to the shape of the house, and so whatever the house was, tree roots certainly weren't intruding. And as a matter of fact, the tree became almost an L-shaped around the house. Of course, as I said, there's not a big hole in the sky where the tree used to be. My question here is that after we do all this, and it seems like a good thing, what's to prevent the new homeowner or the existing homeowner to come in after occupation and cut down all those trees, existing trees?
Councilmember Z, we do not actually regulate that. You have a point that people could go in and cut down the trees after planting them. However, we did commission a study back in 2013. David Chonacki, who was at that time a member of the Tree Commission, who also is, his profession was forest mensuration, and he put together a study where he at about 36 grading plans and found that between 0 years and 18 years after development, that all but 2 of them were on track to meet or exceed 20% within 10 years. So what he found was that people were not cutting down the trees that had been planted. So I have seen it. I would say maybe 3 to 5% of the new trees that get planted do get cut down within 3 years, but it is actually very uncommon. When they go in, they tend to stay there.
Well, thank you for that. The uncommon must be all 3 neighbors on my side. So one on my left, he wanted to put in a swimming pool, so down came 3 fir trees, and the one on the other side, you know, and we all know his name, and he has one big house, and he, you know, he was very proud when he moved in. That's a big tree in the back. Oh my God! Year after we moved in, and the tree turns out to be diseased, and so that big tree went, and the smaller one next to it, and of course the one across the street. There were 3 rather undistinguished but large trees, and now they've been cut down and replaced by this hard stand basketball court, which doesn't drain. So I thank you for your statistic, but all 2 or 3% must be in my neighborhood, and thank you for that.
All right.
I figured this one was going to come up, so I'm bringing it up. 212 Noland, there have been several complaints from residents and neighbors that on this site, all of the trees were removed. And that is true. So if you look at this, the drawing on the far left, that's the before. So that shows the pre-existing house. It's almost before. There's kind of a gravelly thing on the left, like a driveway. That does show the construction entrance. But other than that, that's the pre-existing conditions. So there was a smallish house, there were several trees. Then they're proposing, you'll see in the center view, they're proposing, there are little X's through literally all of the trees. And so if you look at the drawing, you'd say maybe the upper right, there's a larger canopy tree that could be saved. It's not in the way of anything. In the very front, there are a couple of larger trees that are not necessarily in the way. But when we went out to look at those, they were actually in poor condition. So construction access, construction process, condition of trees, those things all kind of factored in on this particular site, and the fact that they were building a house and a swimming pool. So they're required to have drainage so that, you know, the whole yard doesn't drain into their swimming pool or into their house. So they're going to be doing a lot of final grading on this site. So there are times when we push back, but in this case, we didn't see trees that were likely to have more than a 10-year life. And since our horizon for looking at these plans is what it's going to be like in 10 years, if we don't think those trees are likely to be there in 10 years, then we agree with them that the trees need to be removed. So in this case, we did agree. And on the far right, I'm sorry they shaded the canopy because that's canopy that's gone. But the smaller circles that are all lined up, The other unusual thing about this site is, for whatever reason, this house is not being redeveloped for sale. So the person who owns this site did not want any large canopy trees. So our regulations give you almost twice as many points for a canopy tree as for an understory tree, and this person chose to plant all understory. So this is definitely a record in Falls Church City. They're planting 27 new trees and 16 shrubs to meet our canopy cover requirements. I don't like this example because it's highly unusual, but this is an example that's being brought to people's attention, so we need to be aware of it. This is the first time that somebody didn't plant any canopy trees. Like Charles pointed out, you get 175 square feet of canopy credit for something like a tulip poplar or a red maple, and you get 100 for each of these trees that this homeowner is choosing to plant. You also get extra credits for energy conservation. If you're planting a tree that's going to shade the house, understory trees don't get that credit, so he's literally not getting any extra credits, so that's why so many trees. If this were a pattern, I'd worry about it, but this is the first time I've seen a development like this one, so I don't think it is a pattern, at least not yet. So I just wanted to bring it up because I know at least one person emailed me and emailed Mayor Tarter at the same time, and I know that people are concerned that this is the pattern, that this is what happens. When we get to the data section, I'll give you more information about what happens more often, but this is just 212 Noland. Mr. Duncan?
So you asked why?
Oh, did we ask why they don't want any canopy trees?
The rationale, right.
No. I think the company that's preparing the grading plan, they have prepared other grading plans. They normally use larger shade trees to limit the number of trees that must be planted. I think they have all the facts, and that's what they chose. You should also be aware that their bond, the way we enforce this planting is by requiring all new trees to be bonded, and the bonds must be paid before any permits are given. So this homeowner is paying over $22,000 in bonds for the privilege of planting only small trees. So small trees are bonded at the same value as large trees. So yeah, it just, we don't enforce landscape design. That's not what we do. If they have met our requirements, if they have all of the canopy cover credits that they need to have, then we approve the plan. Where we step in is often, if we think it's overplanted, we'll step in and suggest that they use larger trees in order to limit the overplanting. So in this case, I'm sure we did suggest using larger trees, but they came back and said that they would rather not. This is what the client wanted.
It looked like they're trying to screen the sides of the property, and you look at the road there.
Yeah, it does look like they're trying to screen. I'm sure that is what they're doing, since the swimming pool is kind of a highlight of this particular project. But again, the landscape design is not what we're regulating, just that they have adequate canopy cover. Next up will be Kathy Costa talking about some of the data that we have.
This is a chart that was prepared by I can't remember the Virginia Geospatial Program. It's from the Virginia Tech Extension, and it was a collaboration of the Virginia Department of Forestry, the U.S. Forest Service, and Chesapeake Bay Program, and a number of other stakeholders to do a satellite imagery of canopy, and that's how they determine or come to these estimates. So Falls Church is not on this chart. It was apparently too small to be to be considered, but we have a dotted line where Falls Church more or less falls in the middle of the mid-40s there. We tend to say, in the Urban Forestry Commission, we tend to throw around 45%. And in the draft to the natural resources chapter of the comprehensive plan that's currently being worked on, we proposed a goal of 50%, which we think is reachable based on where we are right now. And let me just go to the next. I guess we can stay on this one, even though I'm on the next slide. The developers, as we've talked about, the developers they have to meet a 20% within 10 years. And I think there's sometimes a little confusion around this because so many trees get taken down during development. People think that maybe that's not a high enough requirement. But that's not based on what Kate stated, where we've found on this, was it a 2014 study that David did, that's actually successful. We're replacing that tree canopy, and that's right now the maximum that we can get under code. That's not where our concern is as much as preserving the mature trees that are there and not taking them down in the first place. So, is there something? Oh yeah, we're on the next slide, but the next slide is just text. So
Before you leave that one, so
Yeah.
go back. So if I'm reading this right, Falls Church's tree canopy is equal to or greater than all except 3 jurisdictions, or is it 4? Ashland, Charlottesville, Bradford, Roanoke City. You're 5th, basically.
yeah, we look pretty good there.
And the Fairfax number is said to be generated by Fairfax County. Is there any reason that we couldn't put a bar in there for Falls Church and say, data provided by Falls Church City? Are we comfortable enough with our estimate to go with it?
I have to ask Kate about that.
I honestly don't know who produced the study or when, so I don't really have an opportunity to insert a bar into the graph. I have it as a PDF, and I just drew the line. Yeah.
Now, is it true that what you just said, that these numbers come from satellite imagery, and satellite imagery is, we know, not the most accurate, and there are places like Virginia Beach that are now reducing their coverage by more than 6 to 8% because the satellite imagery tends to pick up everything. So a glossy bush in your front yard looks like a tree to the satellite, and understory trees don't provide any shade, but yet it shows up as coverage. So could it be conceivable that, in trying to reach 50%, that our 46% is not actually 46%, but somewhat less? Could that be possible?
Councilmember Z, it is possible, and I misspoke. What we have been using is actually aerial photos and not satellite photos. There is some difference in that what we're expecting late this year or early next year will be high-resolution aerial photos, which include LiDAR and infrared data. Between the three, between the photos, the infrared, which tells you what's a plant and not a plant, and the LiDAR, which tells you whether something is 10 feet tall or 3 feet tall, I think we'll get a very accurate reading. And yes, our number could go up or down based on that new accuracy. And to speak to Mr. Z's involvement with CEPC, with COG, I'm also a member of the Canopy Cover Work Group, and we are looking at how to compare across jurisdictions. The difficulty with technology is it keeps changing on us, so we are at this point looking at using older data because everyone has it. So even though the Chesapeake Bay region was analyzed using much less detailed photos than what Falls Church has, we may end up seeing some discrepancies between what's published in one document for Falls Church's canopy cover and what's published in our internal documents will not necessarily agree because one's using one technology and one another. But there's nothing we can do about that except recognize it and move forward. I think as long as we're using the best technology we have, I think we want to continue to do that. Even if we have to go a little bit backward in order to share data, I still think we want to move forward.
Okay, just add a couple of points to this that I want to note that this doesn't distinguish between residential and commercial canopy, this chart. And we don't have something that actually shows that, but in Falls Church, residential is the largest part of our mature tree canopy, and so that is the part of the mature tree canopy that's being affected the most by residential development. And merely planting more trees is not going to take care of that perception that all these mature trees are going, and as we know, it takes a long time for those trees to come back up to where they're soaking up as much storm water and having as much pollution, anti-pollution impact as a big tree. I think that's it.
Who wants to be the one who says, those graphs don't show me anything? Charles and I plotted data from everything that we have, and what we found was no pattern. This was what I thought was really interesting. We assumed, or I assumed, that lot size was going to predict how many mature trees were being protected. Not true. We have the strangest variety, and I think it comes down to we have small lots in Falls Church, generally a 1/4 acre or smaller, and we are building big houses. So what gets preserved is an accident of two things. One is there were good, healthy trees on the site to begin with. Not true in all cases. Even though Falls Church has a great canopy cover, some of these redevelopment sites were not in great condition before they were redeveloped, and a lot of the trees were gone. The second accident, of course, is the size and shape of the new house and where it goes on the lot. So the trees that are protected have to be in a place that's out of the way of construction. So I tried all kinds of data analysis and literally came up with no patterns in Falls Church. So we are not able to predict from any sort of, even from the number of trees before development to the number of trees after, because the new house is going to be bigger, it's going to be located where it's located. The number of trees before development is not even a predictor of the number of trees after development. So I'm kind of left with not being able to recommend. For example, codes are generally developed to set up a pattern or to respond to a pattern. We don't have a pattern. So I'm not seeing a way for us to set up, if you see this, then do this, because every site appears to be unique. Can you go forward one, Charles? So some of the data that we found in analyzing, we analyzed the last 4 years of grading plans. So every single grading plan for the last 4 years, which was 102, about 1% of the city's single-family zoned area is redeveloped each year. The zoning and land use covers are slightly different, but they're both, when I run it by single-family detached land use, or when I run it by the single-family zone, which is R1A or R1B, either way, about 1% of the city's single-family area is being redeveloped each year. So not quite as frightening as it appears. It's literally 1% per year being redeveloped. On average, looking at those 102 redevelopment sites, each lot left 19% of itself undisturbed during redevelopment. And back up a little bit, cities, city code regulates, as Kathy pointed out, replanting. We don't have a regulation that says how much canopy cover you need to preserve, but we have a more general code in our stormwater code which says that you need to preserve everything you don't need for development. It specifically lists out the only things that you can disturb are lands that you need for the building itself, for access to construction, for utilities, and for drainage. there's nothing else you're allowed to disturb. So that gives us a lot of leeway to push back. When people, for example, there was one lot on South Spring Street where the developers proposed bulldozing the entire lot. And I said, there are good trees there, why are you bulldozing the entire lot? That's too much. They responded that the slope in the backyard meant that the buyers couldn't really use their backyard. So we sat down and they came up with saving, I think, 3 trees across the back of the lot and then building a retaining wall and then regrading what was in front of the retaining wall. So by having the code the way we have it, we have leeway to sit down with developers and work on each site where we see that we think mature trees could be preserved. Charles has done at least 3 of those, I think, in the last year, where he says, look, there's a perfectly good mature tree. Why don't you just move your limit of development a little bit, limit of disturbance a little bit, and you could protect another tree? They're usually all for it. There are times when a utility or a drainage pattern showing on a different plan sheet that we didn't notice. So sometimes they have to come back and say, no, we can't save that one. But we do try when we see good trees to be preserved, and it does often result in more trees being saved.
Kate, you said that this data was from the past 4 years.
Yes.
Do we notice any trends by year? Because I think there's that perception that while this doesn't look that bad, that it's been getting worse, that we're not preserving as many mature trees, that more trees are lost with each development over time.
Councilmember Hardy, can I just add one thing to that? Although it's only 1%, I think Kate told us earlier that there are about 30 redevelopments of residential properties every year. So in a city this small, every neighborhood is affected and every neighborhood perceives that there's a change. So.
On your previous correlation slide, did you look at not just lot size, but new house size versus number of trees?
I did not.
Meaning area that's green versus number of trees? I don't know if that correlates or not, but you think about a small lot with a big house on it.
Mm-hmm.
What's the donut of green that's remaining?
I could try. We did not actually write down. So when we made the table, we opened up each grading plan one at a time and wrote several things down. I did not write down the house size, but I can check by house size. To see if that's a predictor. It also was a surprise to me that the average was 11% on each lot for preserved canopy coverage. There is actually a really wide range. Of course, there are a lot of zeros. There are some that are like 40 or 50%. So I wouldn't say the 11% is necessarily a median, but there was only one really odd lot and I threw it out. So everything is in a very similar range. So 11% is interesting. The other thing that was interesting, please note that we defined for this study a mature tree. Because the maturity is not something that gets recorded on the grading plan, we used a 4-inch stem size, trunk size for understory trees, and a 12-inch trunk size for canopy trees. Any trees larger than that, because the size is recorded, any trees larger than that were noted as mature trees. So these data refer only to mature trees. Preserved canopy is preserved canopy of any age, but when I'm talking about the number of trees removed and the number of trees preserved, I'm only talking mature trees. So on a lot of lots, there are trees that are preserved that are less than mature. So for example, if they removed every mature tree on the lot, they could still have significant canopy cover because they preserved several younger trees. So just keep that in mind with this data. But the topic tonight was mature trees, and that's what we're looking at. So on average, 5.3 mature trees are lost per lot, and 3.1 mature trees are saved per lot.
Kate, are there any examples in other jurisdictions, and forgive me if this question sounds uneducated, I'm all for mature tree canopy, but my knowledge of tree growth extends only so far, no pun intended. Are there examples in other jurisdictions where they provide or reward or incentivize developers to plant or preserve certain types of trees that may help to mitigate things related to stormwater? And this is where my knowledge may get a bit fuzzy. For example, trees that thrive in wetter environments like a river birch or even a swamp oak, things that soak up a lot of water. Are there examples where we would say, you know, yeah, we want you to preserve 20%, here are the bonuses, but if you plant these types of trees, which actually may benefit in other areas for policy things that we're trying to solve for related to stormwater, that we would actually incentivize people to plant those trees because they soak up more water after 10 years? Is there any examples? Or let me ask this question. Is there any science behind that, or am I just purely blowing smoke here?
Okay, 2 quick answers. Yes, there is science behind that. And no, nobody does it, because the state code is very specific on what you can give credit for and what you can't. So there is a proposal now in the city's legislative package looking at having the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality look into giving trees credit as stormwater BMPs. So currently, that's not on the state's list of things you can give stormwater credit for. So that's why the short answer is no.
Well, from a legislative agenda perspective, does it make sense to get that prescriptive without unintended consequences? Obviously, you don't want every developed lot just having a bunch of swamp oaks on there. But is there, I mean, does it make sense to try to get that prescriptive if we were looking to make changes at the state level? Or is the incremental benefit?
Well, at this point, the recommendation is for the DEQ to do a study, because there's difficulties in giving stormwater credits for trees because they could die, for one thing. So there are so many variables involved with living things and giving credits for living things that it's hard to say what the proposal would be. So at this point, all I can say is that the city does support having a study done, and then depending on the outcome of that study, adopting any code that would result. But so first, the proposal is to do a study. Second, the proposal is to allow cities to adopt code in response to that.
So the proposed legislative positions that come to you would be broad, because we don't know what bills may be introduced, so we could be responsive. But I think the studies for trees as BMPs, and then there's also, Kate's been working with Arlington's peers, and I've been doing that at the legislative. They're doing the trees for BMPs, but they're also looking at the issue of conservation district, because that Fairfax County does do it, but it's actually for planning District 8. So we all could do it, except it's at a half-acre lot. And so for our small lots, and the same for Arlington, by in all essence, we can't do the conservation district. So they are looking at that too, but that also is an incremental, where this time it'd be study, then maybe 21 for a General Assembly, because we don't want unintended consequences.
I think it's time to move on to look at our discussion, and I'm going to introduce Dave DeCoste again.
Okay, so we're almost done here, but this is the point where we want to get some input from the council. So one of the strategies here is, potential strategies is, should we consider different regulations on development, be it requirements, incentives, or zoning variances, and this is across for commercial and residential. Second, do we want to look at incentives for maintaining mature trees over time for residential? Look at the regulations currently in place and for mature tree removal, and educating the community on mature trees and the importance that they have for us and the community. So these are just kind of some thought starters, but we'd like to get input from you as to what suggestions or thoughts, and I know you just had one, but are there any additional ideas or thoughts that we should consider looking into to address this topic.
All right. Mr. Shields, I wonder before we get into this discussion, do you have any thoughts, or could you illuminate for us state regulations that may impact some of the things you might consider? I mean, I know there are a fair amount of rules in Richmond that restrict what we can do, the unfettered right to have new regulations that exceed state requirements. Is there anything that relates to this discussion you might offer to us?
Well, there are. This is a pretty highly regulated area, and local governments do what state governments authorize us to do, and kind of Kate and Charles live in that world every day of kind of the limits of what the state allows us to do. One thing I'll just note, just as an example, our rule of 20% coverage in 10 years, that is a grandfathered provision that is older than the state code provisions, which is the most that a locality can regulate is 20% lot coverage or canopy coverage in 20 years. So that's one we've been a little leery of touching, just out of fear of losing our grandfather status, because we have a higher standard than what's currently allowed under state law. One other issue of state, sort of a general statement, Kate, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but except through the grading plan process for a home, or through the site plan process for a commercial district, local governments are very limited in regulating the removal of trees at all. So per your point, if you're not in the grading plan process and you choose to remove a tree, under Virginia's laws, you have the right to do that. It is in redevelopment you have the opportunity to regulate it. And I think our experience generally is that people love trees, and so they tend not to remove them unless there's a really compelling reason to do so. So that's not usually a big problem, but it is kind of a big hole or loophole in our ability to regulate. Those are two broad statements, but Kate probably can speak to it, and City Attorney Carol McCoskries is here as well.
If I can say one thing, I think it would be nice to bring up the kind of things you'd like to see happen, and we could come back to you with whether they're legal or not, whether they're permissible, whether whether we think they would be effective, because I think sometimes we limit ourselves. For example, we can perhaps only regulate tree removal during development, but do we have some leeway to redefine the threshold of development that needs a permit? I know that the state sets a threshold for grading plans, but there are other building permits that could, I don't know, I haven't researched the legality, be tied to tree removal permits. So maybe some ideas, and then staff could come back and let you know whether they're legal or not. Otherwise, we tie our hands so much that we say, oh my goodness, we can't do anything. We might come up with an interesting thought that we could follow up on if we just throw out there what you think.
All right, let's throw out there what we think. What do you guys think? Any comments? Ms. Hardy?
Oh, sorry. I wanted to ask one question. The trade-off between, when we do commercial developments, often a key tool in capturing excess stormwater runoff is large underground, cisterns, bunkers, whatever. As a result, well, partly as a result of that, but partly as a result of the nature of commercial development, the trees on all the sites that I can think of commercially, on residential redevelopments, are we at the point where we should consider that kind of underground capture for some of these really large houses? I'm thinking one that's in my neighborhood. And if we did, what implications would that have for trees? Would we, lose trees because we're requiring or suggesting underground capture that would help, contain or hold or slow the water runoff?
A quick answer on that one. Commercial developments are generally cleared because the construction is so large to build big buildings that the lot needs to be cleared. On residential developments, we are looking at requiring more stormwater BMPs as opposed to our past practice of buying off-site credits or allowing people to do that. And so Charles and I are going to sit down with our stormwater engineers and figure out what are our preferred BMPs, our preferred stormwater management practices that don't conflict with trees or don't conflict as much with trees. That's kind of a new action to require the on-site treatment, and we are still working out the kinks.
Ms. Hardy?
Well, I'm glad the intersection with stormwater is on there because that was on my list and it sounds like it's on our legislative package already. I had a couple of ideas. So I know we specify specimen trees. Is there a one level below, like a great tree, that we could designate that would encourage their preservation? I know it's a voluntary process now, but is that regulated by code in any way? Like, if not quite specimen, but still really good, and we want you to keep it.
Yeah, do you want me to take that? Yeah, it is actually under code. I don't think the exact term is specimen, but there's memorial, heritage, and historic trees that are allowed to be protected under code. That was one of the other categories where we actually can protect trees. But what we found historically is there aren't very many people who want those trees designated in that way because it then restricts what they can do with their property. And historically, there just haven't, I think actually there was a phase 25 years or 30 years ago in the past when people were designating more specimen trees. And since I've been on the tree commission, we've had maybe 3 or 4 or 5. So there's not a lot of interest out there.
Okay. So I know we're talking incentives, and maybe this has something about my parenting style also. I always think that there's carrots and sticks. What are the penalties right now for violating grading plans? So if people don't do what they're supposed to, or don't get one, or don't plant all the trees they're supposed to, how big are the penalties, and is it enough to prevent the bad behavior from happening?
We typically hit them with fines of around $5,000, and that makes them scream really loud. Yes, okay. They don't like that.
So we think that's a big enough stick already.
I think our stick is pretty big. We do have some definition issues. A couple of people skated around the edge of whether their property was under development or not when they removed the trees, that we will address with the code cleanup we plan to do soon. But as a rule, people are following the rules, and we do, even when they accidentally violate the rules, they get a hefty fee.
Okay. So besides the 50% tree canopy goal across the city, do we have any goals for the residential and commercial areas? And are those things that we could then, encourage people to own? Hey, in residential, we want a goal of X, and in commercial areas, we want a green space coverage of X. I didn't realize it was a hard question.
Sort of. Actually, the Urban Forestry Commission has been advocating for canopy cover goals on commercial development for a long time. So far, the city doesn't have such a thing. State codes, if we were to adopt either of the state codes that regulate canopy cover on development, they would both require us to have canopy cover goals on commercial development. Because our code is grandfathered in, it covers residential only. We're the only people who look at residential only right now.
So what would a goal look like? Is there, how do other people do it? What are their numbers?
It depends, I think, on the intensity of development. What I see is typically 10 or 15% required on commercial development in other in the state code, which could be adopted by other jurisdictions. But again, it depends on the particular land use and intensity of land use, so I don't think it's generally just commercial. There would be one level for commercial, one for multifamily, one for actual commercial.
Okay. Thank you.
Other comments? Mr. Z?
I would just say, generally speaking, I'd like to find ways to incentivize people to maintain mature tree cover. The carrot and stick, I think we've got enough browbeating techniques that you guys feel confident, at least based on the data, that we're moving in the right direction there. But I'm interested in incentivizing people to plant the right types of trees and to maintain. And if that's, credits against stormwater, if that's incentives in other ways, I like that idea. And I certainly, and I think most of us recognize the kind of downstream benefits of starting this incentive process now. And not just solving for it from a new development perspective on the residential side, but solving for it 10, 15, 20 years down the road to incentivize people every time they think about, well, I've got a tree whose branch just fell on top of my car. I'm going to cut that down, to think about the incentive of replacing that, and to think a little more prescriptively about what they can put there and understand that there is some reward to do so.
Mr. Z, would you have some Vice Mayor?
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank the Urban Forestry Commission for having such heart and such diligence and bravery and courage in face of what sometimes seems like a impossible task. They know more about trees than I'll ever learn, and that's a good thing. Someone has to take that position, and certainly appreciate the leadership of Dennis Szymanski and the stalwart work of people like Kathleen Philpott and hopefully our new members who recognize that we have more trees in Falls Church than we have in all of Los Angeles combined. Having said that, the Climate, Energy, and Environmental Policy Committee has embarked on as our arborist said, a study of the region and things that people do and things that could be considered to be best practices, and a way of looking at the canopy in whole from thought to end of life cycle, and how jurisdictions such as ours could be influential in if it is the wish of the population to preserve canopy and to encourage it. So they're coming out with what they call a cookbook, the core of which are things that would be regulatory, could be part of an ordinance. Some of these things are in ordinance now. Many of these things are not. And also what they call side dishes, things that you could consider doing if you want to be truly progressive. So looking forward to that coming out right around the middle of December. I think they said it was the 17th of December where they would come out with this publication. And I would urge that we look at these things, and hopefully the timing is right, but we could put many of these things in our legislative agenda for this coming session, and I think we could have some time to ensure that we have some follow-up. So my takeaway from all this is that I am vastly more encouraged than I ever have in my life about the future of Trees in Falls Church. And at the very beginning you say it's because it makes the summers cooler when you drive into the city from someplace like Tyson's. And at the end of this, you realize it's more than aesthetics or it's how it makes you feel, but it's an important contributor to our resilience as a city going forward, and to play a major part in not only the quality of life, but also retaining stormwater. Thank you.
Vice Mayor?
As I think about trees that are coming down because of development, then the other set of trees that are coming down are just trees that people are taking down. So on the street where I live, I think I would say about 8 large trees have come down in the last 5 years. That people, not because of development, just because for a variety of reasons they're too big. Those tall tulip poplars are too tall, and they're dangerous, and big chunks fall down, so people are removing them. And is there any regulation of that at all? Any way to regulate that?
I don't know for sure whether there's a way to regulate it, but we hesitate to regulate too much. If you imagine if there's a tree in your backyard and you're having to spend a lot of money on it every year and you just decide enough is enough and you want to take it down, you don't want to have to go to the city and have the city say, nope, we think you should spend money on it every year from now till. It's partly that. The other concern that we have as staff is going into people's yards and saying, nope, we don't think that's dangerous, because what if we're wrong? So we don't want to deny permits. If we're not going to deny them, it's difficult to come up with a reason to have them. It's difficult to do public education programs, but I will say that what I was always taught by community liaison officers where I worked before, the law is not why people behave themselves. The law records what we think the standards of behavior should be, but we set those standards. So without a law, you probably wouldn't murder your neighbor. It's just setting a standard. What can we do to ensure that normal behavior in the city of Falls Church is having mature trees, shade trees in your yard? I think that will go the farthest, rather than having city staff knocking on your door and telling you no, no, no.
So when a large tree comes down, do they have to get a permit?
No.
No permit at all?
At this point, what's in code is that a permit is required on commercial property, a permit is required for specimen trees, a permit is required within the RPA, and a permit is required during development or for properties undergoing development. Other than those things, so if you have a single-family home, no tree removal permits are required unless it's RPA or specimen tree or development related.
Does the city ever deny a request for, like, in the RPA? Do you ever deny a request, or do you usually?
We get very few of them, but I think we could. A lot of the RPA, the purpose of the RPA is to buffer streams. So trees don't have to be in good condition to do that. It's like a lot of what people want to do is make their place look nice, and unfortunately stream banks aren't necessarily intended to look nice. They're intended to work. So in the RPA, code requires you to keep trees there unless it's part of an action plan to improve the forest. You can't just remove things willy-nilly.
So we don't really have any way to count how many large mature trees have been removed.
Correct. We have no data. If we don't require permits, then we have no data.
But we do require, like with the stormwater fee, I get credits on my stormwater fee because I have large trees if I request them. Is that correct?
No.
No?
Nope. You can get stormwater credits for planting trees, but I don't know how long they last. And at this point, you don't get stormwater credits for mature trees.
So could that be an incentive?
That's something that we have in our bailiwick that we could look at, yes.
All right, are there other comments?
I just ask one quick, Ms. Connolly's comment reminded me, there are a certain number of folks in town who do regard the large trees in their backyard as either a hazard or an annoyance. And I speak from personal experience here, my neighbors, who came in and cut down all the mature trees except one in their backyard because they have kids and they were concerned that the trees were going to fall on the kids. More so that, I think, than they didn't want to rake the leaves. Although there are some folks who don't want to do that either. So what you're telling me, and you know, there are situations where trees on properties that are leaning over into another neighbor's property are a source of some irritation. Person over here believes that the tree should be cut down because it's leaning over towards their property. The person who has a tree in the yard doesn't want to cut it down because it's a mature tree. So what you're telling me is those sorts of spats, discussions, the city doesn't really get involved in that. You don't want to come on the property and say, yeah, that tree's leaning too far, or that tulip poplar sure looks a little too tall. We're basically on our own for situations like that. Is that right?
Correct. Neighbor spats remain between neighbors, and professional arborists can be paid to look at those things, but city staff does not get involved, no.
Okay, all right, thanks.
All right, other comments? If not, I've got a few. One, I mean, I think what you're doing is great. The trees, the tree canopy in the city, I think is one of the things that makes Falls Church would support the 50% goal that you all mentioned earlier. And given that there is no state regulation, at least in the idea of just incentives, I think 25% would be a great number to seek if there was a way to do it. I'm not sure that's the case. Haven't heard what we heard earlier, but I do like the idea of increasing our tree canopy. I think it would also be great if we could find a way to get more street trees on our residential neighborhoods, through on private property, whether it's some, kind of program or something. I don't think street trees look great, and I know we do them on our commercial streets, but finding a way to either publicly or privately encourage more street trees, particularly on streets that don't have many, if any, street trees, I think would be pretty cool. I think it's been mentioned earlier as well that I think it'd be great over the next couple weeks, given the change in Richmond, to put together a list of things that might be helpful for us to ask for, things that might not have been possible in past sessions of the General Assembly may, in fact, now be possible. And so I think if there are things that you would recommend we seek or ask for from our state legislators, I think we would appreciate hearing that as well. Unless there's anything else, I want to thank you all for the great work. Yes, Dennis.
I just have one thing. When Ms. Hardy asked earlier about commercial canopy, I ducked the question, as did my friend Kathy here. And I would say that we would love to have a conversation with council about tree canopy in commercial redevelopment and keep our powder dry for that discussion.
All right, that sounds good. But again, thank you all for the great work you've done to date and what you continue to do and what you will do. So we appreciate you coming out this evening. All right, thank you so much. All right, our next item, I think, is set for you, Mr. Shields, the City Assistance Program for folks who have sanitary sewer backups.
Thank you, Mayor Tarter. And Mike Whitfield is here as well, and maybe he could join us at the table once folks have cleared out. So what is before council is a proposal to have a city program that would provide financial assistance to homeowners that have experienced a sanitary sewer backflow in their basement, and that assistance program would provide 50% of the cost, a reimbursement of 50% of the cost to install a backflow device, up to cap at $2,000. This program is in existence in the city of Alexandria, and taken many of sort of the key ideas of that program and applied them here in the city of Falls Church. Tonight, we want to just lay out the idea, get some council input for it, and the staff request is that this be scheduled for council authorization and action at your meeting on December 9th. We'll work through some additional details and check some things and produce some more documents for it. The broad outline is here before you tonight. Before we get into this, just a quick update on stormwater matters generally. Just two things to report. One, we've had a very strong response to the creation that the council made of the stormwater task force. And Mr. Z, how many applications is the appointment looking at right now?
38.
So I think that's a record for any board or commission in the city that I can ever recall. And so thank you to all those who have put their names forward to serve, to help the city address our stormwater needs citywide. This program would be paid for out of the sanitary sewer fund, not the stormwater fund, but it is related to big flood events. So let me just speak about what are sanitary sewer backflows and why do they occur, and then discuss the program. So what is it? Not all flooded basements are sanitary sewer backflow. Sanitary sewer backflows are rare, and that is when water comes from either floor drain in your basement or your shower, laundry tub, any facility that is attached to the sanitary sewer system. If the water's coming from there, it's a sanitary sewer backflow. Why does it happen? In an ideal world, there would be no stormwater whatsoever that would ever get into a sanitary sewer pipe. That's the way it's supposed to be. Reality is different from that. So there are two ways to think about it. The majority of the sanitary sewer system is in the street. It is maintained by the city. And laterals, and where a smaller pipe goes to the home. So where is the stormwater coming from? In the street, where it comes from is cracks in the system or illicit connections to the system. So in the public part of the system, where stormwater can get into the system is if the pipes are open, there's cracked joints and things like that. We don't think very much comes in that way because the city has a lining program, and you fund this each year to the tune of about $400,000 a year, where the city goes in and puts fiberglass lining on the inside of the sanitary sewer pipes. In fact, this is one of our largest environmental programs that we have in the city, year in and year out, through the public mains, keeping stormwater out of the sanitary system. It's important work, and it's valuable. So in the areas where we have some of our worst backflows, almost all of the sewer mains have been lined. So we are confident that the water is largely not coming in through the parts of the sewer mains. So where we think it is coming from is old sewer laterals that are cracked and broken. And Cindy, if you scroll up just a little bit of that little graphic. So that's a picture of a sewer lateral. And those get old, water can seep into it just like it would with a French drain if it were designed that way. It's a void in the soil, so high water table water will infiltrate into the pipes. More destructively than that, there are also sump pumps that are hooked up not to discharge out of the yard, discharge to the stormwater system, but they were installed a long time ago and they were tied directly to the sanitary sewer line. Any kind of new permit, any new sump, that's not allowed, but there's some old ones in there. Sometimes people put them in without a permit. Another area where we can get high volumes of water to the sanitary sewer system is picture your basement stair down to walk down the stairs to get into your basement. Very often there's a drain at the bottom of those stairs. In a normal rain, the water falling on those stairs and flowing into that drain is really insignificant. It's not a big deal. But in a big flood, where you have a river of water in the backyard, you can have a waterfall down those stairs, and it's piling up in that basement well. Now you're talking about a lot of water getting into the sanitary sewer system. So those are some examples of how you get the system charged up. So that picture on the right, now the sanitary sewer system has water, stormwater coming into it. The system gets charged, and if your basement is of an elevation and it has fixtures down in the basement, and those fixtures are lower than a manhole out on the street, then the water is going to seek its level and it's going to backflow into your basement. So that's how it happens. So there are areas in the city where we've seen them historically. Typically in the area around Lincoln Avenue, around Worcester. Those are areas with high water table, and we have had a history of sanitary sewer backflows in that area. On the July 8th flood, had sanitary sewer backflows on West Columbia. Had them on as well, Brook Drive, and a lot of that simply because there's a pretty large sewer shed, 2 pipes coming in, teeing into a line that then goes down to Fairfax County. So the program that we're proposing, ultimately, in the long term, we need to work with homeowners to reduce the infiltration into the system. And that's a big policy issue, and that's really not explicitly what's before the council right tonight. And instead, tonight is really a program just to help the symptom of that, provide homeowners that have experienced backflows to have some measure of protection. So the process would be in your packet. There's an application form. What we'd envision is we would publicize this program. It would be designated for areas that have a history of backflows. So for people who are in an area, what we're proposing that are in that area, come in and you apply for it, and you'd be eligible for the program. There would also be a measure in the program that would say if you are outside one of these map areas and you can show you have had this problem, then the Director of Public Works could approve reimbursement for a back device even though you're outside that mapped area. The person would get their building permit. They would install a backflow device with a licensed plumber. They would come back with a proof of payment to that plumber, and the city then would carry out its normal inspection that we would normally do, and Public Works would approve the reimbursement request. Again, it'd be 50% of the cost of the backflow device, or capped at $2,000. That's a pretty good overview of the program, and let me stop there for any questions about it.
All right, any questions, Vice Mayor Conley?
So line 47, it says the property must have a basement.
Yes.
Wasn't there a property in East Columbia that didn't have a basement that had a sewer backflow? Why is that a requirement? They must have a basement.
Well, I will say, split level, for instance, is that a basement or is that not a basement? I don't know. It's a distinction that really matters. But
Just thinking about one house that it's on East Columbia. The woman was here last week and spoke.
okay.
And
We
I
can
don't know
look
her
at that's a
house.
good question. So the short answer is that is typically where they occur. This is a basement issue. 2, we took this language from Alexandria.
And then my other question is, I was talking to somebody this weekend who suggested that the backflow preventer devices should be required to be metal and not plastic. The flap should be metal. Because sometimes critters eat the plastic ones.
Mm-hmm.
That was what I heard from someone who had one on Hillwood. that is, yes, it's doubly gross. But there should be a requirement that the backflow preventer has a metal flap.
All right, Ms. Hardy, then Mr. Snyder.
I'm fine with the 50-50 split. Is there any thought about whether we should do a sliding scale for needier residents? I know it would be more administration, but just an idea.
Mr. Snyder?
Thanks a lot. I support moving forward on this. I think it's a very important thing to do. A couple of technical questions. These things good for? Do they have to be maintained? Tell me a little bit more about the devices themselves.
Well, they do need to be maintained, and so what I think a couple things for homeowners to think about is how you will maintain it. So where is in the basement, so it is possible to have these installed in your home, and there you have a kind of a hatch you can open and you can see it and you can make sure that it's functioning properly. So get them have an electronic device that will tell you if it's functioning. You can have some other, there's options for homeowners to consider. If they're maintained properly, go with the warranty on the device itself, and I don't know that there's a statement about how long they last, but they do need to be maintained. And in our application, you'll note, we try to make it clear that this is the homeowner's decision to install this. The homeowner's picking the one that they're going to use, and the city is not going to maintain it, and the city is not going to take responsibility for the device. This is simply a way to help homeowners that decide to procure one.
Thanks a lot. Just, I should move on. So I think this is a critical issue for government. And I think that it's of all the circumstances, I think, Wyatt, as you pointed out, this is the worst of them all. It's not all, and it doesn't solve a lot of issues we still have to work on, but I think this one is a good one to get moving on. Thanks.
Mr. Duncan?
So, as you described it there, it's going to be installed in the basement near the lowest device that you have, toilet or laundry tub or whatever. So it involves jackhammering up some of the slab and putting it in the ground of the basement and then having an access point to get into it. Is that basically how you describe what gets done?
Yeah, if the homeowner could have it installed out in the yard, that involves getting an excavator there, so that can be a bit more involved. It's typically more expensive. But if you have a really nice finished basement, you might not want to cut into the floor of your basement to have this device installed. So the homeowner would have to make that decision.
Okay. Two other questions. One, the bullet point that says the city must be granted access to verify installation. In the process of verifying that installation, is there some thought that we could gather data on the incursion problem that you mentioned earlier, smoke studies and so forth? I mean, what is our interest in taking advantage of the access that we would gain from doing inspections to get information?
Well, one, just so everyone understands about the access to inspect it, we would always inspect it anyway, so that's not a big thing. But your question is one we're debating internally as well, and so if you look on at line 65 in the staff report, there's a provision in there that says, for discussion, the owner must complete a plumbing inspection to confirm that their home is not contributing to stormwater inflow into the sanitary sewer system through a sump pump, cracked lateral, or the like. That is a bit involved. So to do that, you would need to have a plumber run a TV scope through your lateral to determine its condition. And then for a sump pump connection, you would put dye in the sump. You would run the sump, and then we'd pop the manhole. We'd look and see if that dye is coming out into the system. Now, if it's obvious your sump pump is discharging, you can see right where the outlet is, we'd skip the dye test. But if it's not obvious, it could be tied to the stormwater, but we can't see any of the pipes, then that dye test might need to be required. Now, that is a burden on the homeowner. The idea is you're having a plumber come out and install this backflow device. Why not go ahead and have them do these other two things as well? The benefit is really for society. It's not a benefit for the homeowner.
If anything, it exposes the homeowner to liability to fix something they may not have known or may not want known, I suppose.
Yeah, or with.
Right.
So that's an issue. Staff is recommending that we do have that provision simply because we do want to get at the root causes, but we also recognize that is a burden on the homeowner, and it really gets into this policy discussion that I think we really need more time with about how aggressive the cities should be. And with homeowners where, we're trying to get to the root of inflow into the sanitary sewer system.
Okay, well, I'd be interested what other folks think about that, but before that, just one other question. When a new house is built now, I'm thinking the one that's on Hillwood Avenue, the tear down has just gone in, and what is it, the 800 block? I assume that we're making sure that there are no infiltration issues in new houses, but is the placement of the basements of those houses relative to the height of the manhole cover? I mean, do we look at that, trying basically to either discourage the construction of basements or to raise them up to a level that they would not be subject to these problems?
So Doug Frazier informs me that it is a new provision of the Uniform Statewide Building Code that when you do a substantial rebuild of a house, you need to inspect the sanitary sewer and bring it up to code, the lateral and bring it up to code. So that for any of the tear downs and rebuilds, that is now a code provision. Didn't used to be, but it is now. The elevation of the drains, that relative to the invert of the sanitary sewer, that's always part of a building permit. And typically, right now, if there's a new installation going in, they will require a backflow device, depending on what the delta is between the floor of the basement and the inverted sewer pipe.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Is there any reason to limit the number of times a homeowner would be able to come and ask for this credit? Meaning, I don't necessarily want it to be an open checkbook. If someone has one installed, and I know we're going to be certifying the installation, but this happens repeatedly.
In our conversations with Alexandria, that did not come up as an issue.
Okay.
But we'll need to look into that.
If it's not a concern, I don't know, but it's the fear of the unknown with that. Yeah. I would just, something to think about. It may not be something that we want to put in place now. We may want to revisit, but if you're only going to allocate $50,000 and that's expendable if we have some type of unique situation where somebody puts one of these in and for some reason, geographic or otherwise, it just ends up continuing to break and they keep coming back and asking, and we've done it 3 or 4 times. That's probably an anomaly, but something to think about.
Or any other, Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, City Manager and Director of Public Works for seizing the backflow preventer by the flap, so to speak. Clearly, there's public education that's needed to be able to ensure that whoever a potential applicant might be, that they understand that they have a problem, the root cause of the problem, and to fix it, what the cost might be. I, for one, don't know whether it's a better strategy to have a plumber and grounds crew attached to the city that we could, deploy on a volume purchase scheme. It might be cheaper, might not be. I mean, I would think that every homeowner individually negotiating this has got to be less efficient than having the city do all that. Not to add that to your list of things to do, but it might be more important to get that savings. It dovetails very nicely with my next point, which is that, if you're in this tax-deferred status, you may not be able to afford backflow preventers. So 50-50 could be right for some sort of audience, but for those that are less fortunate, maybe a greater approach like a 20/80 might work. They pay 20, the city pays 80. So let's consider that. Last time we talked about this, I discussed the police powers of the city. And so I was thinking that we could do the inspection, just not by request, but insist upon in those areas where we have these known problems, just to ensure that We cover the waterfront, and as part of our public education campaign that we will inspect what you have, and we ask to do that. And we'll note that if you haven't, that like some things, then we'll assume that you actually have a situation in which you're unwilling to disclose. And so, maybe not now, but I think if that happens, because I can see that if an area that has 30 contributors of people pumping water from their sumps into the system, that once you fix the first 20, the remaining 10 are going to be less likely to fix them. So we should consider some sort of penalty or fine for maintaining that in a grandfather status. And if that doesn't work, then we'll charge them a discharge fee. That's equal to the amount of work that we have to do to maintain the integrity of our system. Just something to consider. And I put it out there for the record, so there it is, citizens. You're warned. You talked about maintenance requirements, so there's that. And you talked about the dye test. It goes to my first point. So as part of this public education, are we going to talk about the need to address your walkout drains at the walkout, or other kinds of area well drains that need to be addressed? Because right now they basically drain to the sanitary, right?
Well, yeah, those basement walkout drains, the older ones, I think there probably are a good number of those that go to the sanitary sewer system. If you think of the elevation of that drain, there's two places it can go. Either it can get into your sump system and drain to your sump, or to the sanitary. Those are the two places where it's generally going.
I think we make that as part of the public education on the website, or some other kind of handout, or access that, so that they don't all have to learn all that by themselves, that we put out there based on our superior knowledge. That's kind of all I have on this. Thank you.
Are there other Vice Mayor Conley?
Mr. Shields, on line 109, it says the BFP should only be installed by a plumber licensed by both the state and the city. Do we keep a list of those? How's a plumber licensed by the city?
Generally through a business license.
The business license. When neighbors talked about this summer when you had the stormwater town hall meeting, there was confusion among neighbors as to what was the best kind of BFP, and different plumbers were recommending different things. Is the city going to offer any kind of guidance on this?
Maybe it could be.
We do have a one pager that provides some technical advice that is available to homeowners. I think people really, it can be confusing. One of the things we're talking about doing is having a list of plumbers. It would not be, the city has a list of arborists that you have to be on that list to do work in the city. I don't think we really can do that for plumbers, and it's a little bit tricky for a city to say you have to be on this list. But it can be helpful just as an aid to homeowners to say, here's some people that have installed them in the city. They've got permits successfully in the past. Here's a list, just as an assistance to homeowners. But ultimately, homeowners can pick anyone who is licensed to do the work.
Manhole covers, there's a reference to manhole covers in here. So in West Columbia, you'll put in new manhole covers in some locations. Is that something that we're going to do more of? What caused us to do it there, and do we have other places we're thinking about doing that?
Sorry. We do have a program where we are replacing covers, rim and covers both. The new ones that we're putting in, they're bolted down. They also have a seal on them. So the sanitary sewer is supposed to be a sealed system. If it is truly a sealed system, then we wouldn't have all this I&I problem.
That's on us. I mean, that's on our dime.
Yes.
So would we, like on Hillwood Avenue, I think there are just the old-fashioned ones that have at least a couple of holes in them. Are we on some schedule to replace those that we can let us and others know about?
Yes, we can. That's kind of the short answer to it. So when we replace those, we have to replace the rim, which is the part that the cover sits in. We have to
Yeah.
chip up the asphalt and
Yeah, it's not, I
So
can see that it's a project. I'm just curious, I mean, is it a project that if we've identified a few key areas that we're gonna implement this program, would seem like that would be the same overlap with where we would be implementing manhole cover replacement.
okay. We don't have any specifically identified right now. These are they're not planned in areas. Typically, when we're replacing those, it's because there's an issue and we know that there's been a problem.
Well, that's what I was thinking. So
Yeah.
these are areas that we know there's a problem, Hillwood, West Columbia, Shadowwalk,
Yep.
the ones you noted. So I would just suggest that, I don't know what cost is involved, if it's a budgetary thing, something that we ought to build into the budget next year. So if we're asking citizens to, put some of their own money into this, then we should do our part too.
All right, any other comments or questions? I think you've probably heard that there's support for moving forward with this program, and maybe give some thought to the idea of some kind of subsidy for people who are already getting tax deferral, and maybe you could come up with some ideas for us to consider along those lines. But let me ask just one question, if I could. Are backflow preventers required, or could we require them for new construction, irrespective of whether there's a problem, just have them be part of our requirement for new home construction?
I'll have to check with Doug Frazier on that. I think currently it's done based on the relative elevation of the basement to the invert of the sewer, but whether we could just do it in all cases or whether even that would be wise, I'll have to check with Doug Frazier.
Okay. All right, well, listen, thank you. We look forward to hearing more about this program, and hopefully it'll make at least a difference in some degree in the issues that folks are dealing with right now. Why don't we move on to the next item, which is the CIP and the council work plan? Thank you. Mike, Mr. Whitfield?
Myself turned on. All right, this is part of the quarterly update for CIP projects that we wanted to retain doing. It's the same format as before, with the snapshot sort of in the traffic signal color coding scheme. I want to do a few highlights, hit a few projects, but not go through them all, and then be glad to have questions or discussions. On the July update, we had 5 projects that were complete at that time, so those are now removed from this quarterly update, and we have 3 additional new ones on the snapshot as being completed. There are a total of 30 projects overall that the city staff are working on, and 13 of those are green and 13 are yellow, so they're moving forward. I'll highlight some of the reds that are on hold and noted as red. Some of that is funding, because we didn't get funding on the last grant cycle, for example, or the funding's coming in FY23 or 24, so we're not actively working it. So just to flag it that way. This go round, we did highlight some recent accomplishments and had the opportunity to include some photos. So we have the Larry Graves ribbon cutting, to signal a completion of a project that's been in the CIP, and then, of course, the West Falls Church groundbreaking for the celebration of starting a $15 million CIP project. So we wanted to be able to message that there has been good success. 8 CIP projects since the last July quarterly update, and this one is good progress with a lot more work to do, of course. Some of the completed ones have been in our parks category this time, with Howard E. Herman, Stream Valley Park, with the sign being completed, so we're now in the formal closeout. The synthetic turf at Larry Graves, and the open space acquisition. Now, there will be, of course, the actual project work for community engagement, park master planning, and then that will become an active phase 2.
Cindy, can I stop you there? For Howard Herman and Big Chimneys, I think we had talked about doing like a joint event, like a joint ribbon cutting and then a groundbreaking at Big Chimneys. Is that on the calendar yet, or do we know when?
It's being worked, but I don't know if there's a specific date.
Yeah, Danny's going to be reaching out to get convenient dates, but I think it'll be on a weekend and try to do a couple of them together.
Which means that Big Chimneys is in pending construction, right?
Yeah, Big Chimneys, we're right on the verge of signing a contract, and so we hope to announce that very shortly.
For City Hall, we have this marked as yellow because while we're progressing, we're not on the original schedule. So we are still progressing. As council knows, everybody is back in City Hall except for the police officers. They'll be coming back in December as we finish out the garage, so the whole police station piece is secure. And then clerk of the courts and courts is expected in January. I have a meeting this week with the magistrate to follow up from the previous meeting and visit with council, and also have a meeting this week with the new clerk of the court, because in this process, the former clerk of the court retired or changed jobs to Warren County, and we have a new clerk. So he's been on site once, but this will be the formal meeting with him. Council has been briefed and will be receiving more briefings on the library renovation as the GMP comes into staff to be reviewed mid-December and then comes to council in January. Certainly that one, as council's aware, is aligning the budget to the current cost with the scope. Facility reinvestment continues, although the majority of the focus has been on City Hall for big project work. On the stormwater side, of course, Wren's Branch is one of the projects been out there, and work is scheduled to begin the beginning of December for that one. And Public Works is actively working with the infrastructure for West End for the sanitary sewer upgrade.
Where's that?
Here's Wren's Branch.
Wren's Branch is kind of where Van Buren hits East Columbia. And so there's one homeowner in particular, it's been flooded. So it's to improve drainage all along Van Buren, but that home in particular would be a beneficiary as well.
And does that fix the sanitary sewer problem too?
No, this is strictly a stormwater.
Okay.
So Wren Branch is stormwater, and then the West End is the sewer. The technology project that's highlighted here is closing out the phone system. This is for all city facilities, but the core PBX and main server is here in City Hall. So as that project moved forward, we were able to deploy the new phone system. One key piece of that to highlight is every phone now includes a panic button that rings directly to dispatch. So employees would only need to push a button on the phone, and it's always in the same place, regardless of which phone you're at. And dispatch can hear what's going on, but anybody in that room will not hear dispatch. So it's two-way communication, but it is only heard in dispatch. And it will facilitate the police being able to deploy in case of emergency. It doesn't replace 911, but it gives another tool for the police to be aware of what's happening in the environment as officers respond.
Does the community center get that as well? Or
Yes, all city facilities have the phone system.
Before we march,
And general government facilities, I should say, the schools are on a separate phone system.
before you march down that page, back to stormwater, the Laura Drive spilling down onto Poplar Catch Basin project, I know that was just one of our small, with existing money, I guess that's not a CIP, but
I think that would be operating.
just to make sure that that shows up as something that we have done is useful.
Well, we have not completed it yet.
You're right. I mean, last time I was there, it was under good way, but So I guess my question is, yeah, let us know when it's done.
Okay. Yes,
And it's not
That's-
showing up here because it's
that
coming
is,
out of.
that is under operating.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
For public safety, I wanted to highlight the fire station 6 because we're finally starting the phase 2 of the HVAC system. Phase 1, which is the upper level that mostly impacts the volunteers and the sleeping quarters, is done. And now the rest of the bays and everything are being done with an upgraded HVAC system appropriate to this type of 24/7 use. The next CIP project that they'll start after this one, which will be the next budget year, will be the doors and the bay heaters. So a lot of the major stuff at the HVAC that we've been seeing in the CIP for the fire station will be done. Windows have been done. Now we have a lot of transportation projects on the list, of course, because that is the larger section of your CIP. Park Avenue, Great Streets is showing 2 red dots because there's 2 funding sources. Both of these are timing of the smart scale and the money that we have available. This is the one that we just applied for an MVTA grant that council approved the resolution last meeting. So this is an example. It's both a funding issue, but just the timing of the money, which is why it's noted as red. South Washington Street Transit Plaza Streetscape, our long-term project, also has 2 active funding sources, and we are now have the smart scale money advanced by VDOT because they had originally put it in out years, which wouldn't have aligned with where we are now. And so we are working in the final stages of VDOT reviewing the procurement documents so we can get them issued. Since we have federal money, VDOT has to sign off on them. So under the current schedule, we should be beginning construction for the next phases of the project next summer.
How long will it take, Cindy?
Mike, do you remember the duration of South Washington? 18 months?
And that'll include the panels, the history
Yes.
panels?
Yeah, so that's the whole road work, the getting rid of the free right turn and the actual transit plaza bus shelters with the historic panels. I wanted to highlight Oak Street Bridge. This is one that, of course, had the flooding and had the sidewalk and asphalt removed, but we already knew that we wanted to and needed to do a full structural replacement work. And it is drivable, but at the reduced weight. But we had applied for SGR funds, and it didn't get funded last time. We're going to apply for it this time. It sounds more promising with how VDOT is doing bridge work now. But of course, we won't know till approved in June of 2020, but VDOT's funding because of the cycle advance won't be till FY21. So it's another one for gap of funding, and then timing is why we've left it marked red.
Cindy, can we go back to South Washington? So it's not listed on there, but we had gotten some citizen concern around the South Washington and Hillwood intersection, which I know is where we had the downed light for a while, and then we put a more permanent one back up, and I think there were some ped improvements that were supposed to be planned. Is that on the CIP?
I don't know that I have that with me, so,
The longer term fix with actual ped heads was talked about.
yeah.
Is that funded in this?
Yeah, I think that's in the out year, and we don't have full funding for that one yet.
So I walked that entire stretch from kind of South Washington, Hillwood to Annandale to Maples. Those 3 intersections get a lot of foot traffic these days, especially with Harris Teeter, and then if we're thinking the investment at Big Chimneys. And so I don't know if there's ways to accelerate those 3 intersections, but in general, we're doing a lot on the northern side of the city. I want to make sure for equity reasons, the south side of the city, which may not have as many vocal residents, get some love too.
Yeah, so we're doing the whole South Washington piece, which will include coming from South Maple. That's a separate project on this list. So we're doing the South Maple, South Washington intersection, then the whole South Washington up.
That takes care
But
further
we still have
south.
to pick the
Annandale,
Yeah.
Hillwood, and those 3 intersections, Maple.
Those right now, they are in the out years of the CIP, but we also need funding to finish them out.
Okay. And then likewise for the rest of South Washington, I know there was that Route 29 working group. They're not going to present us the recommendations, I think, till later this year, but it would be good if staff were involved in hearing some of the recommendations they may came up with, so that at least we could, as we think about the CIP, maybe there's investments we should make further down South Washington.
Yeah, Paul mentioned the next meeting is early December.
That's right. This is the Virginia Tech-led study. So, you know, the purpose of this presentation is projects that are already, that we're actively managing. The 5-year look ahead that will be coming soon, but that's not the focus of this presentation.
And we are in the middle of, staff is updating that. I'll be getting all the submissions updated December 4th, going to the Planning Commission January 20th, and then back to you all in March. So that is actively running concurrent, as Mr. Shields said. And a lot of them are long-term projects that we have in the 10-year window, but a lot of them need funding. We are progressing with Northwest Street in Great Falls with the county.
I'm just going to remind everyone, we do have a closed session tonight as well, so anyway, that's coming up. So
We are trying to still work on signals, both on Broad and North Washington. Bike share is here because the operating grant, we've of course closed out the capital. Neighborhood traffic calming, I wanted to highlight just a little bit with more detail to come, but with Mr. Shields' direction, we've convened a core working group now. We're going to be doing weekly meetings to see where we are on active projects, future projects, the grants, and then work with Mr. Shields to try to formally report out on a more regular basis at a council meeting. So just had the initial meeting today, so we're fine-tuning that process and also looking at how we can enhance the website, use eFocus, and then have an actual schedule for all the projects that are in the queue as well as the grants. So more to come on that as we work on the grant, but also the current funding for Annandale and Gundry, and then in between we're doing cost estimates so council would know how much we would need to clean out the queue now, if you wanted to do it with a budget amendment, or it would be in your next CIP. So with that, and then here's some of the other intersections that you were looking at for the future. Annandale.
all right.
Is money. So with that, I can go for any questions you have, or we can move on to the work session.
Are there any, Vice Mayor Conlon?
On the WNOD Park, the trail crossing and the dual trails, which is very exciting that that's coming. One of the concerns with the stormwater group, when Mr. Snyder and I walked to East Columbia with some of the neighbors, they're really worried that the dual trails there behind East Columbia will exacerbate stormwater problems. Has there been an attempt to work with Nova Parks on the way that those dual trails will help with the drainage?
We've been reaching out on the design piece related to that, so that the city staff is working with Nova Parks.
But they're not, they haven't started their preliminary engineering yet, so.
Okay.
We're at a good point to have a voice.
It says 60% to 90% by January?
That's
The
the,
crossings?
that's our crossings.
Okay, that's our
And
crossings.
then the dual trails is the Nova Parks.
So when do we expect that to happen?
Do you,
I don't know, so we need to reach out to them and find out.
Yeah, I just hate,
They do know that we're.
they knew that, they know, they're aware, that's
Yes,
really
they're
important to us, that
Modular wetland systems. So they're
Oh.
putting swales in and a bunch of other things.
oh,
I sat with the director of planning last night, and he talked about stormwater management was part of the plan that they're doing.
great. Okay.
All right, other questions, comments? Mr. Shields?
If I could give just a very quick update on the council work plan, really with some changes since your last briefing in August. Wayfinding signage, this is in part of your vibrancy and placemaking. The EDA has approved a contract with Fraser and Associates, and they're working right now on a comprehensive package of wayfinding for the commercial district in the city. We anticipate June, we'll have a delivery of their report, and there'll be a lot of consultation between now and then.
With respect to their report, are they going to recommend the actual designs?
Yeah.
And
Concept.
is council going to have any input on that?
Yes.
Okay.
All the EDA is paying for is the study. We still have to pay for the actual sign work.
Okay.
A note on the downtown parking, because I know I'll get this question, but the medallions, I am told, will be painted this week, and the bumpers will be replaced this week as well. That's what I'm told. Flipping ahead, just a note on Founders Row. There will be a neighborhood meeting on November 19th. That's the next one that's scheduled. And I just want to remind people that there's also a process for the design of the mural on the facade facing St. James Church. And that process will begin, I think, we're going to get that process kicked off in the coming month or so. And so, more to come on that.
The Founders Row meeting's at 8:30 in the morning, I understand.
And just one other note, all the parking regs that we put in for the residential streets around Founders Row, those are all have been operational through this fall. Broad Washington, it was noted in the Falls Church News Press today that they have signed a lease with Whole Foods grocers. That will require a whole new special exception to go through its process. We have not yet received an application for such new special exception application. But we do, we'll let people know, and then that's when we'll lay out the schedule. But we expect it will be, the full amendment process that people would expect.
So just for the public's benefit, this will be a full process. It's not going to be an abbreviated process, but public hearings, a full panoply of public hearings and opportunities for input from neighbors and the community as a whole.
That's right. And lastly, the last thing I'll note, because most of the other things have been touched on already, or I don't have significant change, but the environmental sustainability plan, the update to the natural resources chapter of the comprehensive plan, lay out policies as well as their key objectives and goals in this area. That's going to the Planning Commission on December 2nd and will come to the City Council for your review on the 6th. We have a target for wrapping up with final consideration in February.
All right, any questions, comments, Mr. and Ms. Hardy?
Thank you, Mayor. On page 4, where you talk about urban agriculture, I think there's probably more work to be done on this. I'm sure that for Ross Lichtenhouse here, you would have brought that up, but we've acquired the property. So what's next with regard to urban agriculture? And I think that Fairfax City and Montgomery County, two places that have taken a big interest in working that out, and they promised to help. So maybe through NVRC or some other venue, we can get low-cost resources deployed. Mr. Lichtenhouse and I agree that we draw the line with regard to large farm animals at bison. So there's that. On the also on page 4, I think there's a sense among the environmental community and probably lots of citizens here that we need to have an update on the status of solid waste with regard to recycling and other kinds of things. Do we? Well, you know all the issues, so we just need to have that refreshed, and it should be a data-rich presentation. So thank you for that. Also would like to put in front of council and in front of you that we need to start, if we don't have one already, I'm sure we do, parts of a sidewalk study. People keep on talking about sidewalks, and maybe this is the time to look at that. A good time also to get rid of that puny little planting strip that we have on all these sidewalks that just turned to be massive dead vegetation. I like what you did on Virginia Avenue. You got rid of that little planting strip, and it's nice. The little planting strip that we have that was required, I don't know what it's good for except getting mud on your shoes. Sidewalk study. So I don't know what the time frame for that might be, but maybe in time so that we can talk about this, arrive at some forest strategy or not, and not this coming budget cycle, but the next one. So there's that. Also, the topic of accessory dwelling units. I'm sure Mr. Schneider would love to get his hands around these little small buildings, but instead of calling them ADUs, let's call them SDUs. So we call them supplemental dwelling units, because last week I had this heated discussion with the citizen, and we were arguing about ADUs, and it wasn't until 10 minutes into the discussion we were talking about two different things. So let's call it a name that I think all of us can. We'll call it an ADU. That's the old school ADU, and let's call these SDUs, just so for the purpose of clarity.
And can I give just a quick update on in-housing? We did get the grant from VHDA to help us do, Susan Bell, to help us develop language so that we can consider the issue of SDUs, or accessory
Supplemental
units. And then one other piece of work that is actively being done right now is getting a really small contract with commercial real estate advice on setting the cash and lieu formula for us to give us technical advice on that. We've got just look at that. And then we're also working on the fields and information on that with the goal of trying to promote its preservation as affordable housing when the income tax credits expire in 2026.
Good, good. I'm not done yet. So we have two more things. Commercial property assessed clean energy. CPACE keeps, that they're moving out 60 days in the future. I understand the issues, and it's causing difficulties region-wide, if not statewide. I think that it's probably time to bring it before council so that we can get a better understanding of what might be the estoppels toward more wider scale implementation. So I would say let's bring CPACE before us sometime soon. And lastly, in order to get 20 miles an hour on our streets, I understand we have to have a traffic study. So I could write you one on the back of an envelope. Let's get that started.
What does that mean? What does that entail? We just study every street?
I don't know. I don't know that you
Does that
need to
work?
study every street. I think you just need to get a sense of what the impact is. And it can't be that hard. I mean, the first thing we know is if you get hit by a car going 20 miles an hour versus 25 miles an hour, that you have an 80% greater chance of surviving that hit. That alone, I would think, would be a big part of the study.
Mr. Shields, can you look into the requirements of that statewide?
Yeah, we are looking into it right now, and we're trying to get our hands around it.
And would that be done in-house or externally?
Right now, we're just trying to, we're just doing internal, but I think ultimately we need a firm to do the study.
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea, so I'm glad to hear we're making progress on it. Thanks.
Sardi? Then Mr. Ducky?
I was going to check on a couple of walkability improvements. I think this maybe falls under the spot improvements. We had talked about adding PED signals at Great Falls near Lincoln Park. Is that going to happen? As well as Greenwich and Lincoln Park crosswalks and extending a sidewalk there. I think you had mentioned them in one meeting, along with the one at Oak and Seton and then South Maple sidewalk work using the spot improvement money. Is that on track for end of year, or when should we expect those?
So the PED signal at Great on that, and I need to follow up the latest on that. We were trying to determine if we have money left over at the end of the year
I know a lot of people were big fans of them, so I mentioned it, and they're like, "Oh, they love it." I think in general, being able to prioritize where we have high pedestrian traffic or vulnerable, pedestrians like parks and school crossings is important. So if we can, in Great Falls, I know we've heard from that neighborhood before, Great Falls and Lincoln. So I think extra ped heads there would be helpful. And then a retreat to refresh this. Is that on the schedule for January, as we talked about?
It is on the council's schedule for Saturday, January 25th. Cancel the meeting, work session prior to that. Prior to that.
Okay.
Which is also happens to be, I think that would be the Tuesday after Martin Luther King Day. So that work session would be canceled in exchange for a Saturday
All day.
retreat. That's
Okay.
the way it's shown on the schedule right now. So if in the next couple of days, if you all could check your schedules and see if that works for you.
Okay. And then a broader question. So as I was reviewing the CIP update, a lot of the projects had concerns around no PM assigned. Do we feel good that we are on track to resolve that so we get PMs assigned and get projects staffed and underway, or is that something that you need council support on?
We are going to need council support on ultimately. And one bit of good news, we're on the verge of a new hire announcement in the stormwater, for the stormwater team. We've been struggling with our staffing on that. And so that's going to make, I think people are going to see a big difference with bringing that additional staff resource onto our team.
And as part of the neighborhood traffic calming cost estimates for the things in queue, we're also looking at whether we have enough staff resources or we need to do temporary PMs or owner rep to move them along. So cost estimates would be that based once we get our analysis done, but that would be under consideration as well.
Mr. Duncan?
Just one thought. I appreciate the attention to the housing issues, the fields, and the other items you mentioned. Just a thought about the presentation coming up in December about the Gateway project. I thought all the presentations that I heard last week, all 4 of them in 3 days, were very good. The only area that maybe would be deserving of a little more emphasis now that we're beginning to get a feel for what the project's going to actually be would be the housing component, the variety of housing that will be provided in that new community. Everything from 300 square foot micro units that would be affordable for folks who are of more modest income to I'm sure 2,000 square foot condominiums that'll sell for $1 million and everything in between. We haven't talked too much about that just because we've been so focused on the aesthetics and the blocking and the commercial and the relationship to the schools. But I think now would be a good time to begin to turn the community's attention to what we're doing in the area of housing, checking a number of boxes that we've set out for ourselves in providing micro units, workforce, affordable, as all the way up to advanced senior care in that community.
All right. Other comments? Mr. Snyder?
Just a couple quick ones. Wyatt, could you update the community, like what you just told us tonight about hiring and all that kind of thing, so that folks know about that? Secondly, how are we doing on electrification of the fleet and just sort of generally moving away from fossil fuels for our fleet, and getting a hold of all the grant money we can for that? Those are the only 2 questions I had about that.
So eFleet, we are getting a grant to help the schools. Actually, the schools are getting a grant. And I think Tim Stevens was very helpful with us in sort of getting that teed up. But that will be for the electrification of school buses. City fleet, we are, we use biofuels. That's part of our green fleet. We have hybrid vehicles, but we have not yet gotten to plug-ins, and so we're looking at those, how they would serve our needs, and we'll move in that direction as we can. Currently, the purchase price of the all EVs is higher, and so that's something that we confront, but if there are grants available, we'd like to get.
And is there any outreach to the private sector to get more charging stations, like in gas stations and things like that? It just seems to me that the region is kind of falling behind in that area, and the automotive industry is going that direction.
Yeah.
Despite the current federal administration, they're going in that direction. So I just want us to be able to take advantage of that trend, you know, both as a city and as a community. So.
Well, our charging stations here are full all the time now, and it wasn't that way for the first 2 months, but now they're
Well, thank you, Wyatt. I've got my plug-in hybrid EV, even as we speak, charging up. So thank you.
What's great about it is you get to see all the different models that are out there, and there's so much more diversity this week than there was last week. I mean, I feel like it's just changing right before our eyes. But so additional charging stations. Let me get back with you on the latest on that. We were looking for one behind Claire and Don's, and I'll check on the status of that. It would actually end up being on their property as opposed to the city's property. And
Eden Center.
Mr. Go ahead.
Yep.
Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Okay, thanks. One quick thing. This probably goes to our council retreat on the 25th, but also talking about energy plan. We were at the elected officials conference at Nova, Shar School today, and there was a conversation about the solar PPA cap of 50 megawatts that's currently in place. And I know we've talked about this, and I'm going to put this on our legislative agenda, but I did want to raise this as a potentially larger issue as it relates to George Mason High School, which we're delivering net zero with the cap of the 50 megawatts. What may be used up by Fairfax and Loudoun before we get a chance to go through that PPA process is something that one, we need to rally the troops on. We did see Senator Saslaw and Delegate Simon got their ear to discuss this and let them know that we expect for that to be addressed in January session. But as part of our energy plan with that PPA, expecting some changes in Richmond, hopefully in January. We need to keep that on our radar. And as it relates to our energy plan here in the city, I think it's something that we could utilize that would be very powerful for us. So.
All right. Well, a lot going on, and we look forward to accomplishing a whole lot more coming up here soon. Are there any schedule or council comments before we go into closed session?
Just to let everyone know, I think you've all gotten invitations for the Hail and Farewell Party put on by Citizens for a Better City on Wednesday, December 4th at 7:30 p.m. at Nancy Brandon's house. That's for returning and retiring council and school board members. Everyone is invited.
All right, Mr. Snyder?
Just, I wanted to take 1 minute, I don't want to take more than, to review the NVTC meeting last week. Thanks to Ross for attending NVTA. A couple things that are going on. First of all, the bus rapid transit has taken its next step forward, and my understanding is that NVTC will seek a grant to further study it and move it along. So that's gradually becoming a reality. Secondly, the Department of Public Transportation basically clearly stated that they're planning a $3.6 billion, that's with a B, to add to the Long Bridge to serve the whole Northeast Corridor rail system. And interestingly enough, one of the pots of money that they're talking about raising to help pay for that is probably the smallest pot of money out there, which is the I-66 inside the Beltway money that we have been able to access appropriately. I'm pleased to hear that they do plan to maintain that at current levels, but it will not grow under their proposal. So I think this may be a little further discussion. I also, thanks to Chief Gavin making a comment in one of our sessions, I asked the Deputy Secretary of Transportation about seeing traffic divert from I-66 as a result of the tolls, and hopefully staff could follow up. We really need to figure that one out, and he maintains that it's not being diverted on the arterials, but That's not really our concern. Our concern are neighborhood streets that are becoming arterials. So that's an issue. And finally, I asked about the sound walls that are literally falling apart. Join our city, they're probably going to be improved as part of additional lane on I-66 to connecting the Bay to Fairfax Drive. These are all subjects that came up. Some very interesting discussion, but keep in mind that that Long Bridge project is going to be looking for funding all over the place, and so we're going to have to protect those things which are important to us. The other point was the other big capital project would be an additional on the Potomac River crossing for the metro. That was always talked about in tandem with the Long Bridge project, but not that particular project seemed to have fallen off the table in favor of the Long Bridge. So folks just need to be aware of that. Long Bridge would benefit VRE, it would benefit Amtrak, in the sense that it benefits rail up and down the Northeast Corridor, very little direct benefit to us. Thanks.
January 27th, you'll be scheduled to get a BRT presentation for the full council. Staff is reviewing the proposed change to the MOA for Inside 66. So we need to protect us since we're fully in the quarter. Right now, we do have them considering a inflation increase, so it's not a flat dollar, but we're working that.
All right, unless there's anything else, we do have a closed session that will be brief. Mr. Lichtenhouse?
Real quick, speaking of META, one of the interesting points that was made related to funding is that there is some concerns over the 30% funding. We're still trying to figure out why there's a shortage and what that would mean for projections for the next 2 years. Was a presentation by the CFO. So just to make staff aware that those 30% projects, some concern over the revenue coming from Richmond.
Yeah, and gas tax receipts, because of all the EVs, is also, for the first time, I think, ever, miles traveled has increased, but gallons of gas purchased has decreased, and revenues are used to subsidize monitors going down.
All right, why don't we take a short break? We'll go into closed session, and hopefully we'll talk about, yes, we're going to do that. Why don't we go ahead and go into closed session before we pull down the mics? Upon a motion made by Council Member
Donnelly.
and seconded by Council Member Snyder, and passed by a vote of City Council, Council went in a closed session pursuant to Virginia Code Section 2.2 -3711A 8. Consultation with legal counsel employed or retained by a public body regarding specific legal matters of legal advice by such counsel. And this is opioid litigation. Councilmember Connolly?
Yes.
Duncan? Yes. Hardy?
Yes.
Lichtenhouse?
Yeah.
Snyder? Z? Z?
Yeah.
Tar? Yep. All right. So do we need to have the mics taken down, or how's this going to work?
We've reserved the Swallowtail conference room just down here so you can not have to worry about mics and TVs.
All right. We'll take a brief adjournment and come back hopefully very soon.
Yes.
Snyder? Z?
Yes.
Tar? Yep. All right. Anything else to talk about tonight?
Move to adjourn.
All right, let's do it. We're adjourned.